Hello folks and welcome. This is Learn Hittite and today we're continuing with part 2 of our journey into the Altaic hypothesis. In part 1 we focused our attention on Macro-Altaic, so the relationship between Turkic, Mongolic and Tungusic. And we stopped our journey chronologically at around the year 2005. Today we're going to pick things back up, bring ourselves up to date and see how Altaic studies have evolved over the past couple of decades, namely with the arrival of the new kid on the block, Transeurasian. I'll go into what exactly is Transeurasian and where it comes from in just a moment. Now the way I've split these two videos into micro versus macro-Altaic, pre-2005 versus post-2005 is a bit of a strategic choice. Macro-Altaic is an expanded Altaic with the inclusion of the Japonic and Koreanic branches. However, including these two branches in any kind of pre-2005 discussion is in my view somewhat problematic because, to be completely honest, the quality of the data linking these two additional language families was, at that stage anyway, pretty weak and far from convincing. That's not to say that there wasn't any good work done, far from it. The idea that Korean and Japanese might be connected to the so-called Altaic languages actually goes back quite a long way. Japanese was already being brought into the discussion in the 19th century, and throughout the 20th century you've got scholars like Miller, Menges and Starostin trying to build a case for its inclusion. Korean followed a slightly different trajectory, but was also gradually pulled into the Altaic framework. There are, however, some more specific issues when it comes to Koreanic and Japonic themselves. Koreanic, for example, is actually a relatively shallow and internally uniform family, and its history can only be traced back with confidence to around the late 1st millennium AD. Earlier stages are poorly attested, which makes deep comparison problematic. Japonic, on the other hand, is somewhat deeper and better documented, but it brings its own set of problems, especially the fact that early forms, including the so-called para-Japonic on the Korean peninsula, are only very sparsely attested. So basically in both cases, what we're dealing with is limited historical depth and patchy data, which makes any type of comparison inherently tricky. So while early work on Koreanic and Japonic in an Altaic context is important, and we definitely shouldn't ignore it, it's fair to say that by the early 2000s, the case for their inclusion was still very much up in the air. That said, the last 20 years or so, we've seen a real shift. In terms of research attention, the bulk of the work now focuses on the 5 so-called Macro-Altaic languages, with Micro-Altaic increasingly discussed only in that wider context rather than on its own. At the same time, scholarship on both Korean and Japanese has improved significantly. We now have a clearer picture of their internal histories, along with newer attempts at comparative analysis and even some proto-reconstruction between the two. So in other words, some of the gaps earlier scholars were working with have started to close, but plenty of question marks still remain, namely whether Japonic and Koreanic are actually genetically related at all. In recent years, we've also seen the rise of a new term, Transeurasian. Some people dub it Altaic 2.0 or Neo-Altaic. Basically, it's an Altaic rebranding, and we'll get into the background behind Transeurasian and what it means in a moment or two. But for now, it's enough to know that it essentially covers the same 5 languages that were once grouped under Macro-Altaic. The term Altaic itself is now usually reserved for what used to be called Micro-Altaic. Does everything make sense? Good, I hope so. Now, I could have made this part 2 in exactly the same format as part 1, just tagging the Japanese and Korean data onto anything. And honestly, that would have been fairly easy for me, but the result would have been exactly the same. What we would end up with is a group of researchers that we might call die-hard Transeurasianists, and another group opposed to the idea. On one hand, we would have a collection of interesting lexical correspondences and shared structural features, very similar to what we saw with Macro-Altaic, just a little bit more diluted, but when taken together, they still fall short of convincing most researchers that there's a genuine genetic relationship here. And then, just like before with Macro-Altaic, there's that familiar middle ground. People who are happy to see Transeurasian as an areal zone, just a slightly larger one this time. So really, part 2 could have ended up looking exactly the same as part 1. And if you want the quick conclusion to today's video, well, you've basically just had it. The same issues and criticisms thrown towards Macro-Altaic apply to Transeurasian. So instead, what we're going to try and do is focus on what I see as 3 or so major issues with Altaic and Transeurasian studies as they stand today, and what researchers might need to address if they want to try and win over more people to their side. One quick note before we dive in today's video, we're not going to be looking at any archaeological or genetic evidence related to Transeurasian. Primarily because it's not my area, but also because, after consulting the literature, I can see you get the same kind of back and forth there as you do in the linguistic literature. And as one great mind said, languages should speak for themselves. So that's where we're going to keep our focus today. However, I know many of you watching these videos are extremely knowledgeable in those areas, particularly genetics. So please put your views and observations in the comments. It will be a pleasure for me to go through them. Martin Robeets is one of, if not the primary figure behind the current wave of Altaic, or rather Transeurasian, research. A large proportion of the key work in this area features her name as either the primary author or a co-author. But where does the term Transeurasian actually come from, and what's the story behind the researcher driving much of it? Well, in 2003, Martin Robeets defended her doctoral dissertation titled "Is Japanese Related to the Altaic Languages?" A couple of years later, this would serve as the basis for a similarly titled book. Robeets would continue to publish regularly on Altaic related topics until we first get to see the term Transeurasian appear in the title of a 2007 article. The term was essentially a rebranding of Altaic. Transeurasian came to fulfill the role that had previously been given to the term Macro-Altaic, while Altaic itself was relegated somewhat in this new usage and is reserved for the traditional Macro-Altaic grouping. The goal behind this was to achieve a couple of things. Firstly, there had been so many different formulations of Altaic that it was becoming difficult to pin down exactly what the term covered and what it didn't. Transeurasian aimed to fix that. It referred specifically to 5 language families, the 3 of so-called Micro-Altaic, Turkic, Mongolic and Tungusic, plus the 2 Macro-Altaic editions, Japonic and Koreanic. It was also intended to be a more inclusive term. Altaic was often understood as implying a genetic relationship, whereas in Transeurasian studies the term isn't restricted in the same way. It can refer to both a genetic grouping and an areal zone, meaning that for both the so-called retentionists, so those who argue in favour of inheritance, and the diffusionists, those who favour explanations based on contact, can find a place within Transeurasian studies. In that sense, it was maybe an attempt to diffuse the somewhat bitter rivalry that existed, and to be honest still exists, between Altaicists and anti-Altaicists. Whether that will be successful remains to be seen. The rebranding also addressed another issue. The Altai Mountains are no longer widely accepted as the homeland of the family in any meaningful sense, so Transeurasian was seen as a more neutral and probably more appropriate label. I also think the shift in terminology reflects an attempt to move beyond the methodological sins of the Altaic fathers, to distance modern work and modern researchers from some of the issues tied to earlier scholarship. Fast forward a decade or so, and we get the Oxford Guide to the Transeurasian Languages. It's an absolute behemoth of a book, coming in at close to 1,000 pages. Martin Robeets co-edited the volume alongside Alexander Savelyev, another prominent Transeurasian researcher. It's quite pricey in any format, but that's probably as expected. The list of contributors is genuinely stacked. There are plenty of names we've covered here on this channel before. Vaida, Janhunen, Oskolskaya, Blazek, to name just a few. These days, the volume serves as a kind of centrepiece for Transeurasian and Altaic studies. That said, it doesn't stand alone. It sits alongside a much broader body of work that continues to develop around the hypothesis. The first priority for modern Altaicists or Transeurasianists should be to work from the bottom up and firmly establish the relationship between the Japonic and Koreanic branches, followed by pushing towards a solid reconstruction of Proto-Korean Japanese or Proto-Koreo-Japonic, however you want to term it. This matters because in the Transeurasian model, Japonic and Koreanic are said to form a branch of their own, distinct from the so-called Altaic languages. Pretty much every version of Macro-Altaic includes this division, going all the way back to the 1960s. And even modern quantitative statistical analysis tends to point to this as being the most promising area for establishing internal relationships within Transeurasian. Now, I'll be honest, I've never really understood why Transeurasian researchers have tried to link all 5 of these language groups together without first establishing, with some degree of certainty, either the Micro-Altaic core or the Korean-Japanese node, especially since the idea that Korean and Japanese are set apart from the rest is fairly widely accepted. On top of that, there are still some fundamental issues within Koreanic and Japonic that haven't been fully resolved, particularly in phonology and morphology, which makes deeper comparison even more difficult. Now, Martine Robeets does address this in her 2005 work. She points out that binary comparisons are more likely to produce apparent correspondences that are really just chance similarities, whereas bringing in 3 or more languages reduces that risk. That's true, to a point, but introducing a third language, especially one that is geographically or historically connected, doesn't eliminate the problem of a real influence, loanwords and stuff like that. You still need to be able to distinguish inherited material from borrowings and from accidental resemblance. And that requirement doesn't go away just because you increase the number of languages in the comparison. A well-grounded reconstruction of Proto-Korean Japanese would actually make broader comparisons more meaningful. Take something like the proposed Proto-Transeurasian case markers. If Koreanic and Japonic really are related, it makes sense to first understand what is going on at that level before making any wider claims. A clearer picture of Proto-Korean Japanese case morphology or particle morphology would help reduce lookalike comparisons and give us a more reliable baseline for evaluating higher level connections. There's also a practical issue here, which Robeets herself acknowledges. Once you start adding more languages, the complexity of the problem scales very quickly. Given that, it makes much more sense to resolve the smaller problems first. Some attempts have been made to reconstruct Proto-Korean Japanese. So far, all of them are at least somewhat unconvincing, particularly in the Altaic or Transeurasian context. An insightful study from 2020 concluded that Koreanic and Japonic are very much un-Altaic, and instead supports a Paleo-Asiatic origin for the 2 language families. The study does, however, point to periods of contact and convergence with the core Altaic languages, causing some superficial parallels. So it's clear that working from the ground up and confirming or ruling out the Korean-Japanese node should be the first port of call for Transeurasian researchers. Only then would it make sense to begin analysing Koreanic and Japonic in a broader Transeurasian genetic context. Transeurasian posed an opportunity for linguists to essentially start from a clean slate and compose a methodologically rigorous analysis of the Altaic proposition. Now, many of the critiques presented against traditional Altaic work have clearly been addressed in a lot of subsequent Transeurasian work, but almost always the problems aren't completely eradicated and they crop up with an unnecessary level of frequency. Take, for example, the use of external data in internal reconstruction. In the general body of Transeurasian work, it's less of a problem than in earlier Altaic studies, but it still persists. There are scattered examples of this type of stuff throughout Transeurasian, but one example should suffice to show you what's going on. Take this extract from an information file associated with Chapter 36 in the Oxford Guide to the Transeurasian Languages. Here we find a vocabulary list ranked on the basis of semantic stability. The first value, and therefore the most important arguably, is fire. Likely this will be the first entry that any researcher is going to examine, and what we have is an example of external data massaging, so to speak, a reconstruction. Take this Proto-Japonic form, meaning fire. This value here in brackets has been determined based on its appearance in the Korean form. Now this is completely improper in my opinion. Sure, we can use the Korean form to help us reconstruct the theoretical Proto-Korean Japonic form, but the Proto-Japonic form itself should be based only on data from the Japanese languages. Because at this point we have no evidence that the Japanese languages and the Korean languages are actually related. Now you might argue that this is a minor issue, but it's right there in the first comparison item. And in the analysis in the book, forms like this are counted as part of the correspondence set. But it isn't actually there. They've chosen to put it there. At this point, you're more or less making up your own evidence. This is the kind of poor application of methodology that plagued earlier Altaic iterations. And it really is a pity to see it here again, as it reduces the overall quality and reliability of the research output. I mean, would you trust any statistical analysis based on such reconstructions? One thing I will say is that some of the key figures behind Transeurasian clearly want to focus on quality over quantity in terms of lexical correspondences this time around. So thousands of lexical comparisons you won't find here. And actually, I quite like that less is more approach. Really, it's a good way to go about things. But it does mean that the vocabulary that is presented needs to be presented well and as cleanly as possible. And we really don't get that clean presentation here. The correspondences involving liquids across all 5 branches are often just all over the place. Sometimes you find more exceptions than clear patterns, and the data has barely any predictive value. We will talk about this more in detail in just a moment. Some of the reconstructions and forms used are exceedingly hard to justify, and in places really don't reflect what is more commonly reconstructed elsewhere. Then finally we have the odd instance of inconsistent sound correspondences being reported from one table to another, or things like in the supplementary material where I was looking for an explanation behind the Tungusic form for bone, where we get a suffix that I've never seen before. Well, instead of the expected explanation, we find a previous section that has been repasted, I presume by accident. So I had to then go and search through another paper published a year or so later in order to find the actual explanation that I was looking for. In other reviews of Transeurasian work, authors have noticed ghost terms or lexical items attributed to the wrong language. These are small issues, they do appear in papers, but it doesn't exactly fill you with confidence when you're reading any claim regarding Transeurasian lexical similarities and you see these kind of small errors dotted around. So even though the quantity of vocabulary is smaller, it still feels somewhat reminiscent of working with older Altaic materials. You find yourself needing to double check everything. Now, for my final piece of advice, or an area of improvement that I think can be applied to Transeurasian studies, and this one I think is by far the most challenging one to implement, but also I think the one that could convince most people if done well. I would like to see Transeurasian studies focus on really bulletproofing the linguistic data and doing much more to avoid this cycle of argument and counter-argument that was so prevalent in earlier Altaic studies, and this cycle of argumentation never really brought us any closer to a definite answer. In 2021, Martin Robeets and colleagues released the paper titled Triangulation Supports Agricultural Spread of the Transeurasian Languages. In it, we get an expanded vocabulary list alongside a lexical analysis. Much of this data, however, shows the kind of issues that we've just been discussing. A critique published in 2022 then took aim at the linguistic evidence in particular, highlighting a number of these concerns. Robeets subsequently responded with a counter-critique that essentially argued, hey, everything is open to interpretation. Which is kind of true, I guess, and ultimately that's what the problem boils down to. Because I think just naturally, if as a researcher you are more open to long-range comparisons, you're likely to accept data that others would perhaps be more critical of. I mean, what's a missing liquid amongst friends, right? But again, we have this cycle of claim and counterclaim with nothing ever really being definitively resolved, because both sides see their points as being valid. Critics would say that the disappearing liquid value does need to be explained. Altaicists or Transeurasianists would probably just argue it's just one liquid in one vocabulary item. It doesn't undermine the rest of the data, and the cycle repeats. So I was scratching my head thinking, what can be the solution to this never-ending cycle of criticism and counter-criticism? And I think the solution can actually be found in one of Alexander Wovin's papers on Transeurasian. See on screen now. He puts forward a solution, what he calls the Robert Blust test. Now, Blust was an extremely talented linguist, and he managed to present a short 5-line example set at a conference in 1993, I think, that demonstrated with legitimate linguistic elegance that Malay and Hawaiian are genetically related. I'll put the example on screen now. Pause the video if you need to. It's genuinely worth checking this out alongside the paper that it comes from, but I'm not going to dwell on it too much because obviously it's connected to Malay and Hawaiian and not Transeurasian. But basically what Blust test does is it allows us to differentiate between a simple correspondence table, which, to be fair, every long-range proposal these days has, whether spurious or legitimate, and instead it gives us something much stronger. Because a recurrent correspondence can, in theory, be based on just 2 examples. Here, though, we have something much more than that. We have an interconnected set of correspondences where each example supports multiple others in the set, and crucially, if we add new items, we should be able to do so without introducing new ad hoc rules or special correspondences just to make them fit in. Now that's the gold standard, and I admit it's difficult to achieve, but it is possible. Vovin, for example, demonstrated this kind of correspondence set within the Japonic sub-branches. If you're a Transeurasianist, this is really what you're aiming for. If you can build a network of correspondences rather than just a list of examples that breaks down as soon as more data is added, then your argument becomes far more convincing. It doesn't have to be as elegant or as compact as Bluth's example, but the issue is that many of the correspondence sets proposed for Transeurasian really do start to fall apart once more than a handful of examples are brought into the picture. Let me give you a very simple example. First, I was looking at how the liquid values are handled across the Transeurasian datasets, and as I mentioned earlier on, pretty poorly is the answer, as we can see here with this first example, where the Proto-Turkic liquid L is just unaccounted for in the Mongolic term. These sound correspondences here refer to the initial consonant and the second to the vowel. If you want to see the full correspondence set, please check out the original work. Then I thought about looking at the velars between Proto-Mongolic and Proto-Turkic, since we've focused already a lot on the liquids. Here at the bottom we can actually see that the initial k in Turkic can either be a g or k in Mongolic, and they generally behave regularly as far as I can tell in the Transeurasian datasets. But what about the medial values? Well, take the example for molar or fang. Firstly, I want to point out here that the segmentation is highly unusual. You don't see these terms segmented as such elsewhere in the literature. It is also worth pointing out that it's suspected that this is a loan word between Turkic and Mongolic anyway. But it appears in the Transeurasian data, so we're going to analyse it anyway. And we can see that the velar value remains the same in both Proto-Mongolic and Proto-Turkic. However, if we consult the next term, the medial velar value differs between Turkic and Mongolic. But we do have to remember that this value here is a value based on external data. The typical Proto-Turkic reconstruction has a different form. See on screen now. Moving on, this medial value here in this Proto-Mongolic form, according to the correspondence tables, should reflect a p sound in Proto-Turkic, so I have no idea what's going on here. So far, all the examples that we've looked at come from the dataset in the Oxford Guide to the Transeurasian languages, but this next term I took from a later expanded Transeurasian dataset, and we see that the velar value in the Proto-Mongolic is again completely absent in the Proto-Turkic form. So I hope you can see that this is just all over the place, and you can repeat the same activity analysing vowels, or as I said, liquids, and you'll come to the same result. And this is even with giving the authors the maximum benefit of the doubt, because many of these reconstructions don't exactly reflect the linguistic state of the art anyway. Now, I would like nothing more than to sit here and to be able to show you a Bluth-like example for any two of the Transeurasian languages, but as hard as I tried, I just couldn't do it. I focused on comparisons between Koreanic and Japonic, and then Koreanic and Tungusic, but I just couldn't make it work out. And in fact, the more I analysed the data, the worse it got. However, if anyone at home has better success than I did, please do feel free to share your results in the comments. But to sum up, the lexical data supporting Transeurasian needs to be more than just a long list of correspondences that don't hold up to much scrutiny. Robert Bluth's example I gave was just a short and sweet illustration of what great really looks like, in my opinion. Transeurasian doesn't need great in its lexical data, but it does need more consistency and more depth than what is currently presented. Transeurasian really is a better body of work than previous stuff we had concerning Altaic and Macro-Altaic. even though the two are deeply interconnected, and a lot of Altaic work supports Transeurasian, as probably we would expect. In that regard, it was perhaps impossible for Transeurasian to shake off much of the negative opinion associated with Altaic, simply because it is built on the work of Altaicists like Starostin. I mean, you can just see how often old school Altaicists are cited in modern Transeurasian work. I am impressed by the fact that authors try to find interdisciplinary evidence to support Transeurasian. This is commendable, this is intriguing, but here we're focusing on and we're just discussing the Transeurasian languages, and we're concerned about linguistic data, which annoyingly seems to fall into the same pitfalls a lot of earlier Altaic work did. Admittedly, it's somewhat improved, but some of these things can easily be fixed, and I know it seems pedantic, but just some general housekeeping would go a long way. Does it really fill your readers with confidence if you mistype a Japonic example as a Koreanic one, or you mix up correspondence numbers and things like that? These are small things, but the small things go a long way in terms of convincing people, and what we're looking for is consensus in the linguistic community. Using data from language A, for example, to make a form in language B look similar to language A is legitimately what pseudo-linguists do in their papers. It shouldn't be happening here, and it has to stop. Plus, every critique of Altaic and Transeurasian mentions this. I have no idea why authors continue to do this kind of external comparison and leave themselves open for exactly the same criticism that's come before. And what's my final conclusion? My gut instinct is, and has been for a while, that at least some of the so-called Altaic or Transeurasian languages are genetically related to each other. The question is, can we actually demonstrate such a relationship with the data we have currently at hand? And I think, at the moment, the answer is no. That said, if Transeurasian research were to tidy itself up a bit and start working from the ground up, perhaps focusing first on Koreanic and Japonic, and then maybe looking at how Tungusic fits into the picture, we might begin to see more convincing results. Anyway, I feel like I've spoken enough about Altaic and Transeurasian. I do hope you've learned something and found these videos somewhat valuable. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and I would definitely appreciate your input on the genetic and archaeological data in Transeurasian studies. Let me know what you feel they add to the discussion. Now, the last video on Altaic had a like to view ratio over 10% for like the first 6 days or something. And that's awesome. That's the best result I've ever got. So thank you very much for that. However, I would like to ask you to please continue to show your kind support on this video, like and subscribe, that sort of stuff. I really do appreciate it. I'll be back very soon with another video on a language family that I haven't covered before, so it should be a good one. You've been fantastic as always. Goodbye for now.